Welcome to probably one of the best episodes that we're going to record of the Headcount Experts. We're joined by none other than Bryan Hong and Chris Mannion, co-host of the Headcount Experts, and we're here to talk about the people-led transformation of AI. And Bryan's pretty special, not only for his background, his come up in the people space, but in the role that you've taken on here. So I won't spoil it too much in the intro, but welcome, Bryan, to the Headcount Expert.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For the people who don't know who you are or where you're coming from, give us a quick intro. What job do you have now? How are you in this job? How do you describe it to your family at Thanksgiving? What do you tell them?
Yeah, it's a bit of a unique scenario. I spent roughly 10 plus years in recruiting, started out an agency, went to smaller kind of startup for software value-added resellers, so kind of like providing ERP systems to small, medium-sized businesses. But I would say maybe the cool company is probably my current company. I joined Astranis roughly about 100 people as like with a founding recruiter, took over the team and built and scaled the talent function till about 450, went through a couple of rounds of funding. And we currently manufacture satellites here in San Francisco. And I would say roughly 2 years ago, I decided to explore the world of AI and quickly became very, I don't know if like addicted is the right word, but like quickly became very, very tranced by the opportunity, the leverage, the capability extension that it provided, and really just started pursuing that, started to build not just tools and automations, but really kind of larger agentic swarms and kind of setups and orchestrators, which then kind of led to a rabbit hole of me wanting to really try to own that and be able to provide solutions not just to both talent and people, but the entire GNA and anyone who basically wanted it. And so currently I'm the director of PeopleOps and Systems here at Astranis, oversee really all the services across the entire People org. But parallel to that, I have another team that focuses on delivering agents and like AI solutions across GNA. And I've been very fortunate to have a lot of great backers and sponsors here internally at the company. And I think, I guess as of like a few months ago, I was essentially converted over to an engineer, own my own kind of infrastructure, so to speak, and deploy kind of agents at will to different teams. And that's currently where I'm at.
You would have lost my grandma around agentic swarms, but I think for this audience, they're gonna get it. I always make this analogy, like I like photography. In order to take a great picture before the iPhone, you need to know how to take a great picture with a camera. You no longer need to do that. So now people can express themselves without this blocker of knowledge. And AI, at least for myself, I have less access in my company because of the level of infrastructure my code would touch. But nonetheless, the idea is much easier to express myself, whether it's a design idea or an engineering idea using AI. And it's really done a lot in the space, particularly with the code or using the code base to deploy agents to make things more accessible. And I love hearing about the access for a people-led leader. Chris and I have both moved into startups following a people HR style role. And it's not common. I don't see I share the space. A lot of founders, a lot of them do not come from people. I hope to see that transform. What do you think the benefit is of you doing it? It sounds like you've gotten a lot of support. Why is the company recognizing a benefit from seeing someone with your background kind of deploy in this new engineering capacity?
Yeah, I think in a lot of respects, in the past, the idea person and the person that can execute the idea were generally always, not always, but many times there was two sets of these and they were not the same person. I think AI has closed that gap relatively quickly and is making it so that, product managers who can envision a great product now have the ability to prototype them themselves, right? And really, maybe it's not as easy to always communicate exactly what you want to somebody who may not be a domain expert or has the experience of working side by side within your field for, a large amount of years or whatever, and they don't really understand what's happening in your day to day. So when you compare or can consolidate those two individuals of this is the person doing the work and this is the person who can also build and optimize the work with a much higher technical capability, I think that brings a very new value to a variety of different applications, but I think primarily in the corporate functions. I always say the unfortunate truth, in my opinion, is that like people, talent, these technologies were generally last in line for innovation, right? Last time I've checked, I've not heard anyone in my life tell me that, a payroll system has changed their life. So I feel like, yeah, I feel as if there are many opportunities for innovation, optimization, and improvement around both the processes in which we and people, talent, whomever function, but also with what tools we should be using.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Chris probably has a number of opinions coming from the analytics side of Wayfair. But our whole thesis behind the Headcount 365 environment was there's a data set that's not being used by the business. Now, whether you connect directly to the HRIS or you have someone who operates within that data set who wants to then build on top of it or build tools from it, we try to streamline that process. But it's in the same vein of there are ideas that are great in people that don't typically have the maybe budget or attention or prioritization in the business that are still worth solving. And when there's a gap between the person with the idea and the person who needs to develop that idea, and the business is weighing cost benefit or time allocation, product allocation, now, especially, and we can get into this, during a time with discounted tokens during this growth stage of AI, the ambitious have this opportunity to exploit the discount that's meant to drive adoption towards AI for this opportunity. So for me as an HR, the reason why I'm excited about this, and I'm sure Chris is teeming with idea generation that he can bounce off of you, is that this is a very narrow window where we have the ability to prove what's possible out of a people, a talent function, and what's good with the data that comes from those systems, and how can a business use it to be profitable, more efficient? How can we add it to the exec meeting? How can we get people who typically see this as an afterthought or maybe an administrative function to use it as a strategic function? And that's my statement that doesn't have a question mark at the end of it, that I want to initiate further conversation. So Chris, help me out here. What am I trying to ask?
Yeah, I'd love to kind of actually dig into a question and a use case, because I think one of the things that AI has been able to do is really empower a lot of people ops leaders to be their own analyst. So historically, I ran a team of analysts who would support TA leaders. And so they always had to wait for the feedback, the data crunching, and then invariably the first run would never be exactly what they were asking for. And now there are tools available, and even just using Code for Excel, you can actually get to most of the information that you need. One of the challenges that I'm seeing is actually by entrusting a lot of the analytical work to an agent versus an individual, there is a potential to lose some of the understanding in that translation, to the point where you actually take that analysis to a senior leadership team and you have to defend that analysis in person. I'm curious if you've seen that in practice, and also if you have actually figured out a way to actually mitigate that somehow. Like essentially the question is, how can PeopleOps leaders use AI to be their own analyst while not actually getting caught out when the analysis they've done actually gets questioned in a meeting with the CFO?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we have run into this in many cases. I think maybe the most straightforward example is this. For our particular ATS, we have very limited purview within the default analytics module to have certain views. Our leadership expects a certain set of data, and the unfortunate truth is that that view is not technically available by default. So in turn, we'd have to do this very roundabout way where we would essentially connect it to the intelligence connector. So instead of going to an API, we'd go through an S3 or Redline or Redshift or whatever, so that we can go straight to the actual database, pull it into an Excel. Now, for whatever reason, you cannot automate the refresh of that. So someone literally has to go in every single week, click literally a button. For us to be able to execute the weekly report, what we did was we built a custom MCP, and within that custom MCP, we narrowed in on a skill and defined a tool that the MCP uses that is available to the AI that then executes Python. So it becomes to your point, a very consistent static execution of here are the endpoints that I want, here's the formula to calculate it, and here is, so on and so on. Now, if you were to ask the AI to look at other analytics, it'll probably do what you are talking about, which is it may come back, if you ask it five dashboards in a row, same dashboard may come back with 3 different variants. This is very possible. So for the things that are very quantitative, I would say generally you'd want to err on the side of trying to staple in or cement the actual methodology into the tool. And that's what we've seen really great results for like just numeric driven analysis. Once you get to the qualitative side, this is where it starts to get, more wild west. I don't think there's any one way that you can definitively say, but a good example of the one that I had was when we started to hook up AI, we would ask it to, go through anonymous feedback and just say, the question was, are our interviewers interviewing for the qualities and the responsibilities and the requirements that we've posted online? And we found in many cases they were missing or they were misaligned. So, software engineers, sometimes they'd be like, hey, here's a job description. And the AI will come back and say, you guys have an entire interview for debugging, and that's nowhere mentioned on the job posting. So that was like very, very helpful, right? It's great to, otherwise someone would have to be sitting there reading it. The other thing is really around, I would say, maybe quality markers, but this becomes very, very complex where you generally don't want, I would say, a large data set. It's really more of like a control group where maybe you want to align a set of interviewers and you want to build some sort of framework and kind of guide. But even then, I think you have to take it with a grain of salt because to your point, how do you judge or rate a confidence level for how AI is interpreting text? And for that matter, how much confidence do you have in the quality of text being written by every person? So there's a lot of dimensions to that, but there's a lot of interesting questions that can be answered that in the past we probably would never even have tried. Because from a qualitative, for example, like if reading through, I don't know, employee like pulse surveys or performance feedback or, just large bodies of text, it would be near impossible. I mean, Python is pretty close, but really you're just looking for kind of signal marker words at that point. But outside of that, I would say it does open up a lot of new doors. I don't know if Chris, you have, but I have not seen like wow, this is like an amazing use case that seems I'm 100% confident or like, feel very strongly that this is, quality and 100% believable. But perhaps you've seen something that's very exciting or that,
Yeah, I'm actually. So I think the point that you made, I think that I really want to highlight is, I think where a lot of people go is drop data into an LLM, into a chatbot or a tool, and then you get an output. But the variance of that output is dependent on the random seeding of the model, and so it actually can be quite hard to understand what the black box is doing. I think the point that you made, actually, how I do most of my work now, is I use AI to build out a kind of code base, and then the code base provides that repeatability. I think the bonus, and we're probably going to come onto this later if I know where Eric's going with this, is once you've actually built that code base out, you're not using tokens every time you run it, versus you send a 2 meg CSV into an LLM, you're going to be burning through tokens pretty quickly. And so I think that's a really interesting use case, and you can actually start to then experiment with like known starting points and actually see from your examples there of, are our interviewers actually hitting the key points in our structured hiring process? Are they actually scoring against the scorecard, or are they kind of going off script? And the way we actually used to do that would be a huge people analytics project to actually sample transcripts from interviews and then actually use NLP, very, very basic NLP methods to actually look through the transcript and figure out, are we actually hitting the keywords, or do we have the right sentiment within that transcript that matches what we expected when we defined the scorecard? I think what you're suggesting is actually build that infrastructure out. So every time you have an interview, you don't even need to sample. You can just run it through this process and you get an output. I haven't really seen anyone that's doing that at scale. Some of the things that I've actually gotten quite excited about, though, are when a model is used on top of a known kind of scoring framework. for things like performance reviews, where there is a kind of a clear requirement of the level of detail that's expected in a performance review. And the model is not trying to understand with no context. It's actually comparing a performance review submitted by a manager to this definition that HR has scoped and said, this is the level of depth that we require in order to give a quality review. And it's scoring. And if the score drops below a certain level, the review will actually automatically get sent back to the hiring manager to update. And that's not something that you could do realistically with a whole team of HR BPs or support personnel. But the model actually allows that human-to-human interaction to be more productive. So that's an element that I'm actually getting quite excited about, because it goes beyond automating the repetitive low-value tasks, and it actually gets to elevating the thing that talent and PeopleOps is really good at, which is empowering individuals and really kind of growing them. I'm curious if you've seen anything else in that sphere or experimented with anything that has been beneficial.
I would say like one of the more beneficial qualitative analysis that we've done is trying to identify the right talent and matching that with the signals in the hiring process to correlate to actual high performers. And there were quite a few different findings that we have found that are a bit surprising. I would say maybe one of the most surprising ones was that the opposite, which is people who are typically not performing well or don't perform well, were generally all very, very good interviewers, like almost perfect. So maybe with AI at this point, it's even more prevalent because everyone has help. But we found that actually most of our highest performers at one point probably had a small error during their interviews, which that was probably one of the more surprising facts, but it was able to help us define what we should be looking for and how we kind of curbed what focus areas we wanted to define for our interviews, for sure.
It's interesting to hear how I did this article a long time ago for Unicorn that was called like optimal selection methodology, and it's setting a baseline that allow people to be like, you pull the hiring trigger once someone's above a certain average after you've done a sample group. And so I'm sure there's these automations that, again, extracting a people idea into an AI transformation so that it's broadly understood by a group of people. As I listen to the conversation and think about how does the business start to care about this, it's about the findings that you're bringing back to them. It's about changing behavior and drawing it back to the headcount conversation. There's capacity demand in headcount, but there's capacity demand in interviewing. And if you can prove via these new findings that to get to the optimal choice, you need less effort, then you need less recruiters, less hiring managers to meet the demand. And then your capacity demand forecast for headcount looks wildly different. And therefore your cost of finance goes down. So there's a lot of broader implications to a people-led finance process that to me is super interesting as I hear you talk about different ways to either approach the data or justify the data, particularly when it's more complex. That said, on the interviewing side, it is correlated to headcount, but very specifically about the headcount process or management. Have you applied this to what is your general approach to headcount, and how have you applied these AI tools to optimize, change, make more efficient the way you do headcount today?
Yeah, headcount is, it's a very tricky topic, which it's probably obvious why this podcast exists, especially for startups. I think startups have a much more difficult time. If you're Apple, it's quite easy, right? You just, how many, what's the ROI per employee per iPhone or whatever. I think what we try to do as best as possible is to be able to understand the resources that we need in order to meet the business objectives. But in addition to that, we also have this method to basically justify that resource is required. Then there's a shuffle of prioritization around that resource. That happens at the executive level here. So I guess full transparency, maybe I don't have the full secret sauce of exactly how they come up with that number. But what I've been able to do over the last couple of years is, typically we'd have to wait until that planning process is completed for us to be able to then, start to execute, which means from a talent perspective, we'd be behind 3 to 6 months. And so what we tried to do was to build a capacity planner for the team. And we built that using a lot of different inputs, but the basic premise is there's about 15 different inputs. Some are like internal benchmarks, some are external benchmarks, market data, things like that. Then we pair that up with a point system. So typically like 1, 2, 3, 5 is the point system. And each recruiter has some level of capacity of points. So your senior recruiters will be like 15 points. Maybe junior recruiters would be closer to 10 points, something like that. The points are then distributed to the individual roles, representing the difficulty of that role. So if you have a role that is a high level of seniority, very, very rare skill set, typically not within the local region, that would be like a 5. If you wanted, something that is a more maybe basic administration level or very, very common, very, maybe a surplus of that talent group very locally, that would be like a 1. So what I'd be able to do is, kind of stack the numerics so that knowing the recruiter's historical performance across time, we understand what their average contribution is. So you could either stack it to like 15 to 10, and you can blend these roles, and that would be per quarter. And so then you could start to map out the target deliverables per quarter so that we can then reciprocate to the executives. Like, if this is the amount of individuals you need, here's what the current team would be able to deliver, confidently. If we need more or less, they would also tell you how many and what types of recruiters at what levels you may need to add to the team. And then it turns the conversation from a just general, hope this works conversation to, would you, a plus minus. You okay? Like, to meet our objectives, are you okay being 10% short on the resources? Do you have to be 5% over? Do we have to be at? Which then translates to like how you approach the staffing of the different resources that are required in order to fulfill the growth, so to speak.
So you're using AI to drive the algorithms behind the workload distribution, the staffing model for recruiting, and ultimately the conversation with the executives of the business about the trade-offs between recruiting with the resources you have or potentially supplementing those resources with outside recruiters, whether you hire more internally or agencies or contractors, et cetera. That's what did I nail that?
So the unfortunate truth is that it was created and implemented before AI, which was a lot of work and a lot of verification, to the, stakeholders. But yes, at this point, I'm no longer leading talent, but, my good friend Nick, who's currently leading talent here, he is definitely leveraging AI to accelerate that process instead of trying to look up every single benchmark and try to pull all the data and aggregate it. Of course, it has been built into a system that can now facilitate the process in a much more expedited way using AI.
Have you delivered a headcount agent out from your tech stack yet? Whether it's direct or adjacent, do you have something that you've in your capabilities deployed in that way?
We have a very unique outlook on headcount here. So I would say the way that we plan would not facilitate an agent to be very helpful, at least on the planning side. Also, Astranis, as we build satellites, we build them both for different providers of, ISPs or data providers around the world. We also provide them for the government. And so we have some swings around, whether the programs land or not, which also, changes the trajectory of the headcount quite rapidly. And, there's lots of programs, there's lots of customers, which frankly speaking, I think to maybe Eric, this might be where you're getting at, but like to try to do a very formal headcount planning process here, I think maybe potentially like less valuable given how many swings and how often it happens to do like a full end-to-end, very like high confidence run. So as with most startups, I think we're doing the best with what we can.
As someone who set out to solve that problem, I will respectfully disagree, but only because I have some satellite manufacturer customers, some government contractors as well, where I understand there's like a percentage of headcount associated with net new contracts, and there's some algorithms that we've incorporated into the process that I think I would be curious to know. This is a separate conversation. I would actually be curious to know your feedback on whether or not these are or aren't valuable. But I don't know if that's a podcast topic. But we should go down that road.
Open to looking at them for sure.
Bryan Hong, future feedback partner, Headcount 365. All right. Anyway, the point is I think as we look at people-led AI transformation, there's two main things that I like to talk about. One is there's new ideas that haven't had the ability to be extracted and moved into the business. That's one. The second one is the ability of a people team to drive adoption and whether or not the change of this relationship between work and labor should be run by a people team and the benefits of doing it similar to how you would augment labor in any other way. And so I'm curious to know for you specifically in this role, like how do you fit in the org chart? Who do you report to? Who are your peers? Or is it like I've seen things like the talent engineer, the finance engineer, the sales ops engineer. I see these kind of like what used to be sales operations or recruiting operations transform into these roles. And I think a big question for the listeners is like, do you centralize those AI deployment under a central leader, or do you distribute them to their individual teams and figure out, do you have this person and their subject matter expertise kind of deploy the knowledge in that group in a decentralized way for that type of return? How does that work for you guys?
So here at Astranis, I currently report to the SVP of People. I have a team and a manager who oversees people operations and systems, which is your general administration of, payroll system, all the different, chart hop and things like that, onboarding, employee lifecycle type of services, as well as other like employee verification. And then I just have two individuals that one is I brought him on, he was studying data science and he's basically our AI engineer. And there's basically what we refer to maybe as a forward deployed engineer. She's kind of the front facing, talk to different team members, hiring manager, or not hiring managers, but like stakeholders and leaders and kind of trying to define what that process looks like, help them optimize it so that they can apply AI and generate some sort of solution. Also does a lot of the enablement training, stuff like that. At this time, we have two different infrastructures. We own one infrastructure, they own their own. I would say that's probably less common. What I've seen in a lot of cases is that there is the core engineering group, and these people focus on the infrastructure of the AI. So where is it hosted? The security layer, the governance, the identity, observability, things like that. And also the connectivity or integrations and how do you deliver all of those things to whoever wants to use the AI. And then on the other side of the fence, you find the solutions engineer or forward deployed engineer, whatever you want to call them, who are typically now these up and coming super builders that have either been in that space or have kind of learned like myself and understand how to deliver on that process. I would say for areas such as maybe a finance or people, my guess would be the most likely places of a lot of these individuals transitioning would be maybe like a former NetSuite administrator or a Workday analyst. These types of people are pretty prime to easily make that move in, I think, because they have the technical aptitude, but they also understand the workflow side of it. I think I'm probably less common case of just former recruiter, now just full-blown engineering. But I think it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. I think I am seeing that there is a lot of demand for people who are, to your point, in the ops space, but I think there's still quite a bit to bridge between just having an ops builder who is familiar with AI versus those who understand kind of how to actually engineer all the way. And so there's a little bit of a gap there. I'm not saying that I've seen a lot of different kind of setups, but I think that this is kind of like becoming the more common scenario of the infrastructure and how the delivery happens and the security, and then having these peripheral individuals that kind of service the individual teams.
One of the things that actually came out of the SIOP Leading Edge Consortium last year was this framework of actually how AI is impacting not just the way that we do the planning, but also the individual roles that are going to exist in the future and how repurposing actually happens. And that's where I think a lot of the terms like talent engineer or go-to-market engineer or finance engineer are coming from. And it's to do breaking down the old task list that a role would do, automating away everything that is automatable, and then kind of rebuild it into these new positions. And I think the challenge then becomes, to your point, Bryan, of how do you actually get the people that you have to fit into these new roles where the roles are not necessarily always an easy transition. I'm curious if you've seen anything, even at a larger scale or with third parties that are actually helping with that transition to actually upskill those people from, you had a non-traditional path and I think the path that we usually see is what you said, an analyst going into these kind of new roles, but it seems like it's open to many different people. I'm curious what you would recommend to someone who was thinking about that path right now, coming from that background, in terms of actual tangible training and skill development they could do, or projects they should maybe lean into.
My best advice is to use AI. I am a really firm believer that you should use AI to use AI. It is, I think a lot of people, one, get a bit intimidated to use AI, especially if they haven't before. And that's like 50 to 60% of the battle, in my opinion, once you start using it. And then the second real part is that a lot of people define themselves as the limiter. So they say, oh, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what questions to ask. When in reality, you could just ask the AI to say, what questions should I be asking? And this is a very weird thing to think about, because you have this unlimited knowledge partner, which, obviously never existed before the AI of recent times. I will say I have a training that I've built and I haven't released yet, but it kind of tracks my own journey of just when I started with AI, making custom GPTs, my first, YAML schema for like an API and all that kind of stuff. I really just data mined my own sessions to say like, hey, if someone wanted to, kind of follow the similar journey and take a lot of the learnings that I've had over time to not waste time or have very long nights being frustrated. And so I'll probably just release that in the next like month or so. I also think there are a lot of different communities. One community I'm like semi-active in is called PromptMates. They're a group of individuals that started out really, I mean, I met Jason, who's one of the co-founders, and literally we just saw each other. He saw one of my builds and hit me up and said, hey, we should talk. I talked to him. And at that time, which was 2 years ago at this point, I think, or roughly somewhere around there, it was pretty rare to find people in talent just like building agents in AI. And so when you found someone, it was like, it's like meeting your alien, domestic. Yeah, you're like an alien from the same planet as you were somewhere randomly in space. So they have this, I think I want to say it's free. I don't know, but they have a program where they take a bunch of people and they kind of put them through this process of just kind of ramping up in AI. And I've seen some pretty awesome results. I saw this, I remember, I think her name was Brandy. I mean, she went from essentially not being able to prompt, within just a chat to, I think by the end of it, she had like her own GitHub with like a bunch of automations, and that was like maybe a couple weeks. So, I definitely think that there are a lot of programs out there like that. I would warn against very flashy YouTubers. And let me preface this. There's a lot of great YouTubers. Like one person that I followed that really taught me a lot, his name is like Nate Herc. And like he does all these like automations, amazing videos, very easy to follow for someone who's non-technical. But there is a very big caveat to these, hey, I like YouTube's like, oh, I made this AI platform and it automates my whole life over the weekend. It's very easy to do these types of things or try to demo something or make something work very quickly. That is personal to you. It is very, very difficult to try to build something and deploy it at an enterprise production scale. And so, I think what a lot of people sometimes can get caught up in, which even myself I did, was you go to these engineers or, you go to your leadership and say, this solution will solve 80% of our problems. And lo and behold, it's also extracting 90% of all of your data for your employees and your candidates. And it's like a huge legal risk. So yeah, I would just say be wary of the whole like gimmicky, hey, this will solve all your problems. Snake oil AI, although they are very interesting technologies and solutions, and there's a lot to learn from them. But just know that there's an extra layer that you have to go through to try to use it at work. Personally, fine. Like, yeah.
We love PromptMates. Joe and I, when he was at Seed, he had a previous learning platform called Purple. It was fantastic. Jason showed me his like intake session into interview packet way back in the day. So I really love what they're doing. We'll put a link to their stuff down below as well, because it is a worthwhile. I think they have a free and a subscription model. So we'll definitely link it in there. I'm about to cut hard over to it. We have about 15 minutes left. I prepared some reaction content. Let's see what Bryan Hong has to think about the latest and greatest in the headcount ecosphere. All right, article number 1. I think we're all familiar with Benji from Ashby. He is the founder, Benjamin Entz. I want to say it's Entz. Sorry if I butchered that, Benji. He writes an article why an MCP alone doesn't cure weak recruiting reporting. And he makes a few bolded points. One, about the capability, what the MCP-based reporting is able to do, its use case. But he follows on to what their quality and cost are. And he balances where should an MCP be used and how does the underlying app help you be better with your MCP. And so, obviously a plug for Ashby's AI-ready data. I agree with generally where he's coming from, which is if you don't know what you're doing, it's going to cost a lot and the information may not help. I'll pause on this chart here. But Bryan Hong, what's your reaction to Benji's article?
Yeah, I'm just kind of reading the points here. I can agree to this. They're an MCP alone, but let me just put asterisk on that. A generic MCP would fall trap to a lot of these issues. If you understand how to optimize an MCP for your own use case, a lot of this goes away. So to your point, an MCP will call every single API endpoint in search of your answer. If you understand how to build kind of the tool bundling and skilling and optimize the MCP and allow it to understand which sets it would call, triggering based on what kind of requests, then you don't run into this issue of just like a buckshotting of everything, which is the data problem and the cost problem. For the permissioning, that is a real problem. That is very true. Reporting, I actually think there's a lot of really, really cool stuff you can do with AI and MCP. But I don't know if this is just referring to the ATS MCP, but my assumption of this is a lot of MCPs, which there's a lot of really cool things out there. So I think there's, maybe half and half.
Okay. I think for the conversation we were having earlier about AI and the org chart is how many companies can afford the time, the productivity, the cost of having a Bryan who knows this information as an SME to build it versus is this a mass market solution? Are we selling Ashby because most people don't have that? And I think the market will tell us. Chris, what's your thoughts while I pull up the next reaction?
Yeah, I'd say two big things. One of the first one is one of the biggest frustrations I used to have running the tech stack was ownership of the data. And I used to get very frustrated if our data was locked up in a system and I couldn't actually get it out to run that analysis and do all the joins and actually pull everything up. This was at a larger company. And so at a smaller company that don't have a team of analysts, that's probably less of an issue. I think the other point is what we discussed earlier, where we're seeing token spend go up because we're constantly just sending lots of data across to an LLM. I think what Ashby is doing here is quite smart, which is they're actually pre-processing so much of that. So even if you are using an LLM to run the analysis over the top, you're already pre-processed the data. And assuming that the dashboards and the format and the structure is sufficient to give you the answer that you need, I think it's a much better solution for most people. So I think with the caveat of data ownership and the ability to do more things with that, but that may be just me and probably Bryan, I would imagine, based on what he said as well.
I think when the cost of Bryan is less than the cost of tokens, we'll see more Bryans. But for now, tokens are so cheap, you can buckshot all you want. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. The next reaction. Am I doing it? Am I sharing it? There we go.
Yep.
Mr. Parker Gilbert, the co-founder of Numeric, wants to add some context to the finance engineer. Now, as you can tell, I'm plugging Headcount 365 like a founder would do, using his reach for my own benefit. Thanks, Parker. The best finance engineers aren't going to be accountants who do something a percentage better. They're going to be engineers. Now, I think I know where you're going to go with this one, Bryan, based on the earlier conversation, but what's your reaction to the shift in some of these roles from being a subject matter expert to being this more engineering mindset?
I agree with this 100%. Primarily because I think the people that the smaller basic functionality that AI provides, and this post kind of really emphasizes that, a dashboard, an analysis. I think these things will within a couple months' time, just like, Ashby is embedding AI, these things will be free. They're not going to be work. It's just going to exist. And so the individual that can not only engineer, architect the workflow, but then to Chris's earlier point, be able to translate that into an actual business impact or an initiative or a strategy or a decision or a pivot versus just, hey, we automated this work. Let's not look at it. You have to be able to say, because the trade-off is also you've automated all this work with AI. What are we getting out of it? Because that also takes time, right? It takes time. It's going to take resources, albeit to your point, maybe get cheaper tokens over time. But yeah, I agree with that. I think the days of just build this dashboard, fix this Excel spreadsheet, that's probably coming to an end.
Chris, any thoughts? Well, I have a nice transitional piece that we'll finish on before we let Bryan plug any of the things that he's looking to plug on the platform. But Chris, give me your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously going to be biased because I'm an engineer who moved into talent via supply chain, and I think that engineering skill set of systems thinking applied to a domain, I think is really powerful. Even hiring analysts back in the day, the biggest challenge was someone who's very technically proficient as an analyst but can't apply it to a domain was really tricky to place. And so I think what he's saying is that you need both skill sets. You need the domain application and you need the kind of technical understanding. And if you understand accounting and engineering together, it doesn't matter which direction you're coming from, is the caveat I would add. I think we should think about the people in the future as being engineers as opposed to historic roles.
I agree. Last one, Destiny Thompson, Chief People Officer, consultant. She's talking about the framing of workforce reshaping around AI. And her point is that the layoffs cite AI as a reason, but the savings aren't coming as a function of the AI. So it's a discrepancy between, hey, we're cutting because of AI versus we're actually cutting for this other reason and using AI as the scapegoat. Bryan, what's your take?
So sorry, just to be clear, Destiny is saying people are doing layoffs, but they're citing AI, but it's actually not the reason. Is that right?
The savings coming from AI are not that it's not the cuts are happening in the name of AI, but the savings aren't coming from AI.
Man, I feel like this is a hard one. Like it kind of depends. I think there's areas which AI is definitely saving a lot of money. As to whether or not that is, allowing you to cut resources, I think again in certain cases it's possible. I think in other cases it's quite the opposite, where maybe I've also seen the market where some organizations, especially startups, they rather would hire 2 staff or senior engineers that can use AI really well over like 10 new grads. And that's because the productivity output, like orders of magnitude difference in some industries, but not in all. And so, yeah, I think it just depends. And I've been very fortunate, Astranis, we've never had any layoffs. So maybe I'm not a good person to ask for this particular reaction.
I always like to survey the market. I have a very particular opinion, but before I close with it, Chris, what's your take?
Yeah, actually, this is time. I didn't tell you this beforehand, but I've just been doing a bunch of roundtables with portfolios, and so I actually just pulled this data on the AI-driven layoff impact. And there was like 3 examples I gave where large companies did these huge AI restructurings and then regretted it, and then had to like double up hiring in 2026. So you got like IBM, Klarna, Duolingo. Could maybe flash those on the screen. What we're actually seeing is not the kind of reduction in roles, and 20% is the number that's always thrown around, but 20% reduction in the tasks within those roles, but doesn't necessarily cleanly relate to 20% fewer people, because you've got to add back in reviews, you've got to add back in any kind of like legal issues. You've got to actually think about transition plan. You've got to think about oversight. And so that like 20%, you may be able to automate 20% of the tasks, but you can't automate 20% of the people. And so I think that's where the delta's coming from. And even though AI is disrupting the workforce, it's actually kind of a restructuring of how the work does business. And it's not going to happen overnight. This is a multi-year transition, which I think is the part that a lot of people miss. So it's like soapbox moment, but I have actually a full part framework. I've just finished recording this, over an hour worth of video. So I'm not going to go into any detail here, but it's like the step-by-step process of how you would actually do this if you were rebuilding that plan from scratch for a large organization.
I'm a bit of a history buff. very recent current events, let's call it. And as a former Uber employee, let's just say the cost to go from my house in LA to the airport has significantly increased since the reliance on Uber has become the primary thing. So, we may be short term in our cost mindset as we think about this process. And I think it's easy for companies to adopt, but history tells me there's a future where token costs go up once we're relying on them. I don't know. I'm not an oracle. But that being said, I'm curious to see how it all shakes out and whether or not there'd be a different conversations between the relationship between human and AI labor. That said, we're about at time. It's 9:55 in the morning here in Los Angeles. We've been doing about 50 minutes of recording, and we like to close with giving Bryan the platform to plug things like PromptMates. Give Bryan the opportunity to plug things like PromptMates, his own projects and training, and Astranis if there's any careers that you think are worthwhile to mention on the Headcount Experts podcast. I'll put links in the description below so that everyone can see what Bryan's working on or see what Astranis is working on. But Bryan, the floor is yours. What do you want to talk about? Any place you want to send traffic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only place if you want to catch up or get a bunch of random free builds around both people and talent is probably my GitHub. So the GitHub is basically one prompt, man. And yeah, I guess I'll just share the link. But that's like pretty much the only place I'll have trainings, a couple of different builds. I do a variety of platforms. So like I do like N8N, Claude Cowork plugins, Claude Code frameworks and stuff like that. So if you're curious, especially around the, again, people and talent space, then let's say head there and hopefully you find something you like.
I love it. I will link the GitHub down below. You can find Bryan at Astranis in the PromptMates community on GitHub and here at the Headcount Experts. It's been wonderful to talk to you about your role and kind of like this new thing that's been created in the age of AI. And yeah, tremendously grateful you've given us the time to kind of give us that inside look. So looking forward to the next episode of the Headcount Experts, where we'll talk about not only this conversation, but a continuation of AI in the org chart. And we'll be following up that with a blog shortly after. So thanks, Bryan, for joining us. Chris, any closing statements for the episode, the 25th episode of the Headcount Experts? Anything to close?
I think Bryan's a great example of someone who's made this transition that a lot of people are actually looking to make right now. And I speak to people every week. So hopefully everyone's taken all the really great nuggets from Bryan's experience and actually be able to apply them. So I'm really excited to hopefully see some people give us feedback that this is really helping. So thank you so much, Bryan.
I love it. The labor market doom and gloom we should focus on the new positions created, the new opportunity. There's a whole new economy coming. Bryan's a leading example. Really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, guys.